Well, welcome again to another edition of Ask the Pastor. I have as my very special guests today, Barbara and Floy Jumper, and we are filming today at the parlor of Chestnut Mountain Presbyterian Church before an audience of 2. And if you don't know this lovely, gracious couple, let me just say, Floy serves on the staff as the facility manager, maintaining, among other things, all 69 toilets in the building with a plumb. And Barbara serves on the women's leadership team. They both have been Christians a long time, and let me just ask how long that's been.
Since I was about 15 years old. And I felt at that time a real call for the Lord to lead my life for the rest of my life. And so I started active in our church probably as a teenager, and then more active as one of the younger women in my 20s.
Well, that is really cool. Floy, how about you? How long have you been?
Since I was 8 or a little over 8 years old, and the reason for that was because my father died when I was 6. And subsequent to that, I began asking questions about how can I be sure I'll see my daddy again. And as a result of that, was led by a very sweet pastor to Christ at a very early age.
Well, that's a wonderful story, and we're not going to delve into it.
So that would be 63 years ago, in case you want to know how old I am.
Okay. And just for clarity, Floy robbed the cradle when he married.
Yes, I did.
Oh, weren't you good?
Yes, I did.
So,
you get extra points for that.
You both have been in church leadership in other churches. Just how long have you served in another church, Floy?
I was a deacon from the time I was 21 or 22 years old, and I became an elder when I was about 35 in another Presbyterian denomination.
Okay. And Barbara?
Well, early 20s, I started in the women's circle groups at our church, which was like a Bible study in our church. And I don't remember, I think I was the leader of one of my circles by the time I was in my late 20s. So.
Well, wonderful. That means you both bring a great deal of experience and perspective to the life of the church. And I know that you've enriched the life of Chestnut Mountain in many, many ways. And I want to ask you, because you all have shared some stories in the context of other group settings we've been in, to share a couple of the stories that you've shared with others this morning about your experiences in some of these other churches and places you've been.
Well, particularly one story that I think is applicable here now, and by the way, we love this church so much. This is a great church, and we love it very much. We were in a church that was founded in 1836, so by the time the story I'm telling you took place, the church had already been in existence for right at 150 years. And had a longtime pastor retire after approximately 30 years. A beloved longtime pastor retired and then subsequently passed away. And then we got another pastor who was almost a direct replacement for Dr. Marshburn. He was sort of a Dr. Marshburn clone in some ways. And so there wasn't much upheaval then. And then when he retired, by the time he retired, the physical circumstances around the church had changed. The neighborhood had changed. There was a rapid transit station right next to the church, and ultimately became uncomfortable, particularly for ladies, but for everyone, to come to church at night. There was a lot of fear about that. And so there began a discussion about the relocation of the church. And the church at that time had been in that location for about 125 or 130 years. There was still a well out on the property where you could draw water. And so that discussion about moving the church became very controversial. And in the midst of that, we were looking for a pastor. I was on the search committee for a pastor, and people were in a hurry to get a pastor. I think there was a feeling that we needed to resolve that issue of whether or not we were going to move the church. That needed to be resolved. And at that point in time, the prevailing opinion seemed to be we need to get a pastor so we can get that done. And when you look back in retrospect, it wasn't very fair to the pastor to have that big question looming when he gets there. Nevertheless, we called a pastor who was a great guy, but he became he was the point of admiration from the folks who thought we needed to move the church because he felt that way. And then there were other people who really didn't like him much for the same reason. And it made it a bad situation for him. So he was only there, Barbara and I have been talking about how long, but 3 or 4 years.
Not long.
Like I said, a great guy. And I honestly believe had we had that issue resolved before he got there, he could have stayed there till he retired. But that's just not the way it worked out. And then subsequent to that, Barbara was on the next search committee.
My turn.
Your turn.
And so we started out very with the charge to make sure that we had planned correctly for the next pastor, because the church was sort of in a almost split situation, and we knew we needed healing, and still knew that we possibly needed to move, but at the same time we needed healing before we could even attempt that. So it probably took us several months of meetings with a bunch of different people that didn't really know what they were doing to start with on the search committee, but after several meetings, we realized that we needed to get together and plan like the vision of the church, the beliefs of the church, the mission of the church, and make all of that very clear, along with asking, okay, what do we really want in a pastor? What kind of a pastor? And by the time the committee, sort of chomped on all of that and tried to figure that out, it was probably 2 or 3 months later before we actually felt like we could, we had gotten our ideas hewn down to where we really felt like we could call somebody or ask somebody for, references. And we even had to have a questionnaire that they had to fill out. So there was a lot of back duty that we ended up going through. So it was months before we actually felt like we could even go through that process. And I understand Flourish is doing a lot of that for our church, which I think is a wonderful thing for Chestnut Mountain, because that was hard for the search committee to get to that point. But when we did finally do that, then it still took months, because we had to listen to sermons of people the applicants that had asked. We listened to multiple sermons, and of course back then it wasn't as available as it is now to listen to sermons. So some of our committee even had to go to their home churches and sit in the back and pretend like they were not there and listen. And then we, hashed all that out. So anyway, long story short, it took quite a long time before we finally got down to the pastor that we felt like the Lord had called. And of course, there was a lot of prayer involved in that. But the new pastor was someone that was a very praying pastor and said, okay, this is what we need to do. And we got together as a congregation on several different occasions and had prayer groups just for the purpose of healing and deciding what to do with the church. He was a wonderful guy. We had him for a good long while, and I'm going to let Floy tell you from there what happened next.
Well, I'll say this, just to sort of give you some context. The time without a pastor, both of those times, probably was a cumulative total of 4 or 4.5 years.
Yes.
It took a couple of years the first time because people were a little bit apprehensive about coming there because they knew the issues we were dealing with. and they knew that we'd had a long-time pastor in the recent past. So it took a lot of courage to come there. But once the second pastor got there and the healing sort of started, then we got down to the tough business of making that decision, which should have been made before we ever called the first guy. And I've thought about in the past, in a recent past, what would either one of those pastors say if you ask them, would you have preferred that we had settled that issue before you got there? And it would be a resounding yes from both of them, I know.
But at the same time, the Lord blessed, there was a reason for both of those things to happen. We believe that. We believe there was a reason, but at the same time, it was still difficult for the church.
It was, and at the end of all that, by God's grace, when we did move the church in 2000, the year 2000, we lost, I think, 6 or 8 folks who just couldn't make that transition out of a pretty big congregation. So that was a blessing. But yeah, I think both of them would have said yes, absolutely. So when I look at the Flourish process, at first I was apprehensive about it. Didn't quite understand what it was about. But now that I know more about what Flourish is doing, what we're doing with Flourish, I think it's a very valuable process. I think I think it will make the search process be done more quickly, because a prospective pastor will know where we are as a church and what our goals are and where we stand today. And so it'll be more of a known than an unknown. I think that's a big positive. But I'm an impatient person, so I'm, have been one of those people saying, come on, let's get going here. But I think this is a very valuable process, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. So you've pointed out a number of lessons that you think are pertinent out of your experience that offer wisdom for the church. I don't know if there's something else that you want to add to that?
Not particularly. I don't know that I want to even agree with your statement that we've offered any wisdom. Barbara may have. No. Barbara may have, but I don't think I have. But it has been our experience, and it brings back memories for us, and we think we wish we could have known. I was an elder during all this, but I never knew of any such thing as an intentional interim pastor. Our first pastor we called after the longtime guys retired was an unintentional interim. That was not what we intended, but that's what it turned out to be. He was sort of a sacrificial pastor. He came and bore the burden and then left. So, I think this is a good process. That's all I know to say about it. Even though I'm impatient, I still am 100% behind it.
Well, and because of all the time that our committee spent to do what I know Flourish is doing for us, it would have been a quicker process, plus we would have had a better vision for what we needed to do.
Absolutely.
So we appreciate this, we really do.
Well, thank you. So I think you've touched on a number of themes that I want to close with. I want to close with just a few verses from Proverbs. That book gives us God's wisdom and insight about life as it shares for us the perspective of what ordinary experience is. And the book reflects one of the truths that some people in the church are experiencing. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. And that observation connects to a couple of other sets of Proverbs. One of them is about waiting, and the other is about planning, and how we need to keep all three of these perspectives together. So Proverbs says a few things about planning. Without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. Commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Plans are established by counsel, wise guidance, wage war. By wise guidance, wage war. And the plans of the diligent surely lead to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And so there's this interplay between God's at work directing and responsible planning. And then the Bible calls us to wait, as you pointed out.
Patience
Waiting
is hard.
Yeah, waiting is hard. And as Christians, of course, hopefully we're waiting for the return of the Lord. Waiting is fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. I just want to close with a couple of verses from the Psalms. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. And so only God can provide his man for Chestnut Mountain. And some of that involves waiting. And some of it involves planning. And some of it involves benefiting from the counsel and the wisdom of others, so that your plans in seeking a pastor are as carefully and responsibly done as you can be. In the end, God, yes, he's in control, but it'd be imprudent to think we should just wait till God puts somebody on the front steps anymore, than we should expect that Ingalls is going to deliver our groceries this week with our meal plan in mind. Well, thank you so much for joining us for Ask the Pastor this morning. I want to especially say thank you for coming in and so early in the morning and sharing in front of the camera today.
Thank you.
Thank you.